Hi, my name is Linda Oltman and I am the Education Coordinator for the Perkiomen Watershed Conservancy. And today we're going to be doing a demonstration here on my coffee table. And this demonstration is going to give us a better idea of what life is like in a flowing or low-tick water environment. So still water is called lentic and flowing water is called low-tick. So I have set up a stream here on my coffee table. This blue cloth here represents the stream. And we are going to be adding some props here. So the first thing I want to add is an arrow that's going to show us the direction of the flow of the water here. So in this case, we have the water flowing here and downstream this way. So of course water is always going to follow the elevation of the land, flowing from higher elevation to lower elevation. So the stream that we normally go to with students that visit the Conservancy is called the East Branch of the Perkiomen Creek. And that particular creek happens to be a rocky bottom creek. So I'm going to add some rocks to our stream. So I have some smaller rocks here that I'm just going to add to our stream to represent the fact that we have a rocky bottom stream. Now these rocks provide great habitat for the different organisms that are living on the bottom of the creek here. We have a whole community of organisms that spend most of their life on the bottom of the creek. These are known as benthic organisms. And today we're going to be focusing on a particular type of organism. They're called macroinvertebrates. So a macroinvertebrate is a general term for organisms that are big enough to see without a microscope, so you can see them with your eyes, but they do not have a backbone, so no internal skeleton like you and I have. So this does not include, frogs or fish or any of those kind of organisms, but it does include a number of different types of insect larvae, crayfish, and other crustaceans, mollusks, so it's a whole variety of different types of organisms that are macroinvertebrates. So we're going to take a look at the stream here. So we have some rocks. Now we're going to add some different organisms to our creek. So the first one we're going to add is what's called a water penny. So the water penny is the larva of a beetle, which when it goes through its pupa stage and emerges, it will be a beetle that lives on the land. It's actually rarely seen, but very often seen in the larval stage. So I'm going to place this organism somewhere in our creek here. Now, if I were to take this organism and place it, on top of the rock like that, first of all, it would be very vulnerable to predators. A fish could come along and easily take it off the top of that rock. But the other thing that can happen, and as the water is flowing, is that this organism might get lifted up off the rock and then it would get washed downstream. So a better place for this organism to be would be under or behind the rock. So we're just going to kind of tuck it under there. Now this organism feeds on the algae that's growing on that rock. So it's what we call a scraper grazer, and it actually scrapes the algae off the rock and it feeds on the algae. So it spends its whole life kind of cruising around that rock, munching on the algae. So next we're going to add what's called a stonefly nymph. Now, the nymph is a little different than the larva. A nymph will not go through a pupa stage like a larva does. And this organism will just shed its exoskeleton a number of times, and then it will emerge as an adult flying insect. So the stonefly feeds a little bit differently than the water penny. The water penny is what we call a scraper grazer, whereas this guy is known as a shredder. So this guy loves to eat pieces of leaves and other kind of vegetation that has fallen into the creek, and it shreds them up into smaller pieces, and a lot of those pieces end up going downstream, but it does consume those smaller pieces that it shreds up. Now again, this organism, it's not going to be safe on top of the rock, so we're going to also tuck this organism under this rock so it can stay in place and be safe. All right, next we're going to add a freshwater clam. Now, the clam is not an insect, it's a mollusk, it's a bivalve, and this clam has 2 shells, and what it does is it buries itself down into the gravel. So it has 2 shells that it keeps closed most of the time, and then it has something called a foot that comes out. It's like a jelly-like kind of thing that comes out, and it can use that to drill itself down into the gravel. And then once it's down in the gravel, it opens its shells a little bit and it puts out its siphons. So the siphons are like 2 straw-like organs that one of the siphons is drawing water in, and inside the clam's body it filters out small particles of food, and then it shoots the filtered water out through the other siphon. So the clam, we're just going to put him over here and say that he has kind of dug himself down into the gravel. All right, and the next thing we're going to look at here is a little bit larger organism known as the crayfish. Now the crayfish is definitely a little more mobile than these other organisms, so it will come out and kind of, hunt and walk around the East Branch, although it does like to spend a good bit of its time hiding underneath the rocks. Now the crayfish has a really interesting adaptation. When it gets scared, instead of going forward like most organisms would, it kind of tucks in its tail and it scoots backwards really quickly. So if you were trying to capture a crayfish, you would want to go behind it where its tail is and try to scare it so it backs up into your net or container. So the crayfish is not a picky eater. It will eat pretty much anything. So sometimes it's a predator. It will hunt other things. It might be trying to catch some of these other macroinvertebrates. Or it might be scavenging on things. It might eat dead things. It might eat plants. Pretty much anything it can find. So I'm going to tuck this little crayfish here under this rock. Now we have several different macroinvertebrates in place in our stream here. And the next thing we're going to add is something called the Riparian Buffer. So that is basically a big fancy term for all of the stream side plants. So I'm going to add a number of plants. I have some trees here. We'll put some trees and some grasses. And we're just going to make sure we have a nice riparian buffer here growing along both sides of our creek. Now this is probably the most important part of this whole thing as far as the health of the stream. This riparian buffer is really, really important for a number of reasons. The first reason is that, of course, these are all plants. They're all producers. They're all producing food. So when these plants, produce these leaves and seeds and flowers, a lot of these things, when they fall off of the plants, they can make their way down into the East Branch Creek, either by wind or by water. And once in the creek, they become a really, really important food source for the macroinvertebrates. So that's really important. They also help protect the East Branch physically. They're a physical barrier as stormwater comes running down the hill and trying to take everything in its path with it into the water. These plants kind of slow down the flow, and they help get the water into the ground instead of having everything just run off into the creek. So they kind of hold on to the soil, keep it in place, prevent erosion. So these plants, this is probably the most important part of this whole thing. the more riparian buffers we have protecting our creeks in general, the better the water quality is going to be. So now we have everything in place, and we're going to be kind of going through a 3-act scenario of things that might happen in this creek. So we are going to have a leaf, and we'll be talking about what happens to the leaf, a fish, and a frog. So our first act is going to be what happens to this leaf. So we have a nice green leaf here. So all summer long this leaf is, up in the tree, and it's undergoing photosynthesis, producing food. And then when the fall comes and the days grow shorter and it gets colder, it turns a lovely shade of orange. And then one day it falls off the tree and flutters down and lands in the East Branch Creek. Now, once it's in the water, it begins to move downstream, and as it does, sometimes it might get caught on a rock for a while, and bacteria and fungus kind of invade the leaf and start to decompose it, so it starts to break down into smaller parts, and it continues downstream, and as it gets close enough to this stonefly, the stonefly can reach out with one of the little hooks on its feet and grab this leaf, and it's going to shred up that leaf, and it's going to have that leaf for a meal. Now, this leaf is actually part of the stonefly, so we're going to put him in there. All right, next we have a fish. This is actually an ocean fish, but we'll pretend it's a freshwater fish. So this fish is out one day, and it's swimming around the East Branch Creek, and it was totally unaware that nearby there was a dad who decided he was going to take his children fishing that day down at the East Branch Creek. So Dad and the kids, load up the fishing rods and the cooler, and before they leave, Mom says to them, "Why don't you bring back some nice fish fillets for dinner? But make sure you fillet the fish down at the creek, because I don't want to deal with any fish guts here at the house." So Dad says fine, and him and the kids are off at the creek. So here's our little fish swimming around, and before he knows what's happening here, all of a sudden a big juicy worm appears before his eyes. And of course he's going to swim up and he's going to grab that worm. And before he knows what's going on, he gets pulled out of the East Branch Creek, and Dad gets out his knife, chops off his head, takes out his guts, and throws him in the cooler for dinner. But Dad now has a dirty knife, so he takes his knife and he washes it off in the creek, and little tiny microscopic bits of this fish are now in the water going downstream. Floating downstream past the water penny, who doesn't care about this because it's grazing on his rock. The stonefly is busy munching on his leaf, but further downstream there is a clam that has its siphons out, and these fish particles get sucked into the clam and get filtered out and become a meal for the clam. Next star of our show here is a little frog. Now, we don't have blue frogs in the Perkiomen Valleys, but we'll pretend that this is a green frog that might be living around here. And this frog is out in the shallow water one morning, and he's not really paying attention to what is sneaking up behind him. And that morning there happens to be a great blue heron who is looking for a meal. And the heron very quietly sneaks up behind that frog and reaches in and grabs him out of the stream and has a meal of the frog. But a small piece of the frog's leg breaks off in the process and falls into the creek and begins to float downstream. So here we have a frog leg in the water, floating downstream, past the water penny, who's still grazing on his rock, past the stonefly, who's still munching on his leaf. This is too big for the clam, but further downstream there is a crayfish who is happy to come out and grab this tasty frog leg. So now that frog is part of the crayfish. As you can see, in a stream or any flowing water environment, a lot of it is about organisms finding a way to stay in place, you know, and wait for things to come downstream on the flow of water. And again, the most important part of this whole thing is this riparian buffer, which helps to feed and protect the water quality of this creek.